Welcome back, Marines, and those of you that are interested in the fall from grace for the Department of Ohio. As in previous episodes, this entire tragedy could have been avoided if the National Staff officers, particularly Mr. Baker and Mr. Samora, would have took some sort of corrective action, instead of fumbling. I tried for approximately 9 months to rectify the quorum violations by submitting proposals to both the national and the department leadership. The national leadership, however, was not on board with doing anything to rectify these issues, as stated by Mr. Baker and Mr. Samora. They also allowed it to continue on at the department level by interceding with fraudulent elections and installations, trying to circumvent our national bylaws and or department bylaws that have been suspended. So, after 15 plus filings or so with the State Attorney General's office and approximately 10 or so with the IRS, and without any support at all from the national leadership all the way down to the department commandants, everyone knew that we had problems in Ohio. Everybody could have helped. Anybody could have suggested. No one did nothing. It was time to file charges against Mr. Baker and Mr. Samora. Now, we'll cover that later on in their presentations. However, in this one, we want to go ahead and show you how it all ties together. I wanted to illustrate it so that even a blind man could understand the corruption of the knucklehead gang. And that's my name for those folks. So, again, I am the whistleblower that exposed the wrongdoings of the national and department to the IRS in late June of 2022. And just to clarify for those of you that are wondering, how could I do this? Yes, as a volunteer in an organization, you can be protected by the Whistleblower Act if violations are of misconduct and intentional failure to do the judicial or the general mission statement of the organization. In other words, if I was the commandant of the Marine Corps League and I instructed someone to do something that fell outside of the bounds of the Marine Corps League probably could not be sued, but the individual in that position could be, because of the failure to comply and knowingly doing things that were against the traditions and or customs, courtesies, policies, or procedures. So yes, you can be a whistleblower. Don't ever think you can't. You have rights. Now, Mr. Baker, Mr. Borker, and Mr. Samora had to do something. IRS contacted them in early July and asked about what is going on in the Department of Ohio and within their own organization as to these allegations of quorum violations. So, what had to happen? And that's what we're going to cover moving forward. As you can see by this slide, these are the individuals we will be discussing moving forward in these presentations. The members that were not at or served on a national level or capacity were left off this slide intentionally. As a heads up, we will begin with the Oversight Committee, members who directly and intentionally lied to the membership of the Department of Ohio on behalf of Mr. Baker. The reason the department officers are off of this Oversight Committee list is because we've already covered them in previous presentations. So, what do you suppose they produced to minimize the investigation of the IRS into these allegations of fraud and misconduct? Now, on the previous slide, we did mention that they received notification from the IRS that they're being investigated, and they had to come up with some kind of response. Well, Mr. Baker told a fellow or a former PDC of the Department of Ohio, first and foremost, we need to get rid of Marine Smith. He knows too much, was the words, exact verbiage used by Johnny Baker. However, prior to all that, he had indicated to Mr. Samora and possibly Mr. Borka that they needed to illustrate for the IRS their willingness to do the right thing and suspend the Charter of Ohio based on an investigation from the national office, which prompted the July 15th letter appointing an investigative committee. So the national claims that there was a thorough investigation into the issues Ohio was facing, and in less than 7 days, they discovered the quorum issue. 7 days it took them to find it. Now, this came after almost a year worth of notifications with proposals and finally charge sheets against Mr. Baker and Mr. Samora for those very violations, along with the department leadership that they've all found had no merit. It took them 7 days to find that it did have merit. And so they suspended the charter for the Department of Ohio. Now, as a member of the organization, was a member of the organization, you have the same rights as I do to request to view documents that pertain to the organization and its operations. Requested said copy of report on the Department of Ohio. The response from the national was, we don't need to see it. What use do we have to look at it? That's not appropriate. It's not a classified document. It's not proprietary in nature. Therefore, they should have provided it along with any minutes and or financials, things of those nature that you do have a right to see or request per the law. So we finally did a formal request for that documentation, similar to a Freedom of Information Act, but using the Ohio state laws instead. And the response was, we seem to not be able to find it now. Don't know what happened to it. So, go figure, right? Why keep something around that's going to incriminate you? Why keep it on hand for others to see how badly you led the department down this road? Now, this fact will later corroborate the pattern of not being able to produce documents that are necessary for the accountability or the transparency, all the while demonstrating the actions of the Oversight Committee were not being handled in accordance with the August 5th letter. It's amazing, isn't it? It's just amazing. The National Board of Trustees held a meeting on 13 July 2022 after receiving notification from the IRS. They went ahead and approved the creation of a special committee to investigate the current situation in the Department of Ohio. In particular, the committee was charged with the reviewing of recent elections, the officer installations, and other actions which may have occurred without having satisfied the quorum requirements according to the Department of Ohio national bylaws. The National Board of Trustees met again on 31 July, just maybe 2 weeks later, and was briefed by the special committee report on the results of the investigation into Ohio's quorum issues. The National Board of Trustees determined, based on the evidence and the report, that there was sufficient grounds to temporarily suspend the Department of Ohio's charter. And I quote, "The Department of Ohio bylaws and administrative procedures were determined to be too restrictive and not compliant with the national bylaws, and the national bylaws mandate that they be compliant." The National Board of Trustees, therefore, authorized the creation of a Department of Ohio Oversight Committee based on that singular finding, the complicity or the compliance of the bylaws in Ohio with the national, as to what it meant to be operating without a quorum since June 2021 to August 5th, 2022. Quite a time. So, let me read from the national bylaws, and then I will read from the department bylaws that were approved in 2019 by Warren Griffin as the national NJA. And you can be the judge of how restrictive they may or may not be. You must know, though, that the national bylaws of August 2022 were also approved and signed by Mr. Griffin again, Mr. Baker, and Mr. Miller. So it's a pretty good chance that they might know a little bit of what's contained in the documents in regards to the quorum. Now, the national bylaws of 2022, Article 4, Section 410 reads, and I quote, "The minimum number required to transact the regular and legal business of the National Convention shall be the registered and approved delegates in good standing from a majority of all chartered departments in the Marine Corps League." Plain, cut, and simple, not too restrictive, right to the point. So what does the department say and take from that for their bylaws? Remember, we can't be in conflict with the national. So, Article 4, Section 410 of the 2019 approved bylaws for the Department of Ohio reads, and I quote, "The minimum number required to transact the regular and legal business of a department convention shall be the registered and approved delegates in good standing from a majority of all chartered detachments in the Department of Ohio Marine Corps League." I think you probably see the two words that changed. And maybe you could see it's verbatim or mirrors exactly what the national is saying. So I guess part of that statement that it didn't go in compliance with the national is incorrect. The second portion of the quorum, because there are three main quorums addressed in the bylaws, the second is Article 6, Section 635. "A majority of the National Board of Trustees shall constitute a quorum." The department says in Article 6, 635, "A majority of the department, Board of Trustees, shall constitute a quorum." The last big one in the national bylaws is Article 8, Section 835, deals with department conventions. "The quorum for a department convention and for department staff meetings may be set by the department bylaws, or in the absence of a number," that's what they're talking, in the absence of that number, you need to refer to the department convention for the quorum. Now, this was listed in Article 4, Section 410 in both documents. So that's what it says at the national. So at the department level, for Section 835, Article 8, Section 835, "The quorum for department conventions and for department staff meetings may be set by the department bylaws, or in the absence thereof, by the department convention." Ladies and gentlemen, anyone can see that this is verbatim. Anyone can see that it's not restrictive because it is in compliance with and is not in conflict with the national bylaws. So that statement, that finding in the investigation back in mid-July, presented to the National Board of Trustees that warranted the suspension of the Department of Ohio's charter, was based on lies and falsehoods. It was part of the plan to cover and to get rid of the individuals and or issues that came up from the quorum violations and were addressed by the IRS to them. This is how they answered them. So, most of you and all, and myself included, being that we're on this kind of media and doing media type things and being able to read and understand English, those of them in the national leadership, however, I believe they rode the short bus to school, brother. I believe they rode on the short bus. Because I'm sure even you, if you're not a Marine Corps League member, even you could see the hypocrisy of it all. The claim alone suggesting that the department's bylaws that were approved again by national did not comply with the national bylaws and were too restrictive in nature, thereby causing said detachments not to attend said meetings. And that's in the August 5th letter. They quoted that. That's the reason they didn't come to the department meetings, and that's why they couldn't get a quorum. When in fact, if they did do an investigation, which we know they didn't, they would have discovered the most of the detachments could not stand or tolerate the department leadership and their continual disagreements, arguments, and their total disrespect, not only for the individual delegate from the detachment, but for the detachments as displayed in these meetings, was not going to be tolerated any longer. And that's why the numbers dropped. It had nothing, absolutely nothing, to do with the bylaws, again, that mirrored the national bylaws. It had everything to do with the disgust of the leadership. So, if you allow things like this to happen, in other words, they come out with a finding that the suspend your charter because of some BS reason that is not substantiated or proven, and they're allowed to continue to operate in that manner, shame on you. And that's why you see me doing all of this, is because shame on them. I'm not going to have that and roll over and walk away as if nothing happened. They are a group of liars misrepresenting the truth and the facts, and they've manipulated the leadership or the possibility of sound leadership and good standing of the Department of Ohio. Unbelievable. Many of you probably know what an oversight committee is. For those that don't, it's a group of individuals or a council that watches for oversights, errors, mistakes, or exercises some sort of supervision over a specific project, a program, or agency such as the Department of Ohio. This committee may be endowed with various types of members, duties, and powers, totally depending on the context and the purpose of its creation. This one in particular was created by the National Board of Trustees and Johnny Baker. The intent and the purpose and the operation of said committee and the charter suspension came in a letter dated August 5th, 2022 from Johnny Baker, the National Commandant, and the National Board of Trustees. They felt that because the Department of Ohio failed to adhere to the national and department bylaws, that the charter should be suspended until June of 2023. Remember me discussing this with you just a couple minutes ago? They based it on that quorum, and they based it on it being too restrictive and not in compliance. So they went ahead and instructed Mr. Baker to publish a letter indicating all these things that we've been talking about throughout this series, and to assign an oversight committee to the Department of Ohio for its operations. And Mr. Holt was appointed the chairman, as noted on previous slides. Now, Mr. Holt and his crew were tasked with various things. And some of these that I'm listing are contained directly in that letter. And I quote, the August 5th letter, I'm quoting, states, by indicating that the current officers and most of the Department of Ohio Board of Trustees were not duly elected and therefore ineligible to continue to serve in an official capacity. That's pretty plain, cut, and simple to me. To most Americans, to most individuals who can read and understand English. However, next paragraph down in the letter, he switches tracks like a train heading to nowhere. Mr. Baker goes ahead and makes the following statement within the letter, and anybody can pull this letter, anybody can get a copy, and you can verify it. I'm not making this up. Like I told you before, who could make this shit up? But anyway, he states the following, a paragraph down. During this period of suspension, and this is, I'm quoting, during this period of suspension, the oversight of the Department of Operations will be administered by the Department of Ohio Oversight Committee, understandable, which was authorized by the Board of Trustees, understandable, period. He goes on. Roger Smith, current Department of Ohio Commandant, and selected other Department of Ohio officers will continue to handle operational functions under the supervision of the National Board of Trustees and the Department of Oversight Committee. Wow. Talk about leaving the fox in the hen house, right? No way that he could even think of doing this after a thorough investigation, not finding that those are the very same individuals that violated the quorum issue to begin with. So, what do we say? The charter, again, folks, was suspended because the very same officers listed, and I quote, the committee determined that the current Department of Ohio officers were elected and or installed during that 2021 Department of Ohio convention did not have a quorum. A majority of chartered detachments was not present at that convention, but he leaves them in place anyway. Wow. It's hard to believe. So, another part of that job assignment in that letter for the Oversight Committee was that they will immediately create a workable draft governing document that will be used to continue the day-to-day operations of the Department of Ohio and its detachments. This governing document will be structured as the department bylaws. The department and its members will have the opportunity to ratify this draft governing document as the official department bylaws at the next Department of Ohio annual convention. The proposed ratification of said documents never was sent to the detachment commandants for review and input. No one attended the conferences or meetings. They never had a quorum to review said changes. And the word just never got out. So, and why do I say that? Well, many of our detachments in Ohio do not even have the means to download or visit a website, let alone review a document found on an email. It wouldn't have took much for them to turn around and stuff those changes in an envelope and send them to the detachments. So, however, in the interests of allowing this to move forward, the responsibility of ensuring that the approved document presented at the convention contained the approval of the National Board of Trustees, Mr. Holt was also tasked with submitting the final documentation to the National Board of Trustees for review and approval prior to the June 2023 convention. And I quote from the letter, the Oversight Committee will submit these proposed governing documents to the National Board of Trustees for approval, and they will ultimately be presented to the department members for approval as the revised department bylaws at the next department convention, June of 2023. And this is how it's supposed to work, is that the National Board of Trustees approve the proposal or the draft submitted by the Oversight Committee on how things should work moving forward in Ohio. Once that happens, they give their approval or disapproval. They do it based via a letter, or it's contained in the minutes that they all voted on it, and use that as a copy for validation that it was approved, and send it back to Mr. Holt to present at the department's convention in June of 2023. So, did that happen? Well, no, it did not happen. As a matter of fact, the draft would be questioned or brought up on the point of order motion on the floor of the current or the June convention that just ended this past Sunday. The question was asked, point of order. Do we have a quorum to hold the June convention in accordance with the national bylaws? Because the current department bylaws are in suspension, thereby forcing the department or mandating the department adhere to the next governing document that's approved, which is the national bylaws. A roll call of detachments was called for. It came to be that there was only 11 of 33 detachments represented. And we read what the quorum was for the national office, for meetings, conventions. It was the same for the department. A majority of all chartered detachments should be present for the department convention, which means 17. They did not have a quorum. However, Mr. Holt began talking about the newly approved department bylaws with a cover letter signed by Mr. Miller that they lowered the quorum to members present. Does anybody know what that means? It's a mob rule. Whoever shows up for the meeting gets to make the decisions for the Department of Ohio, not its representation or its delegates. Just whoever shows up. It's a mob rule. Unbelievable. Point of order again came up on the floor. Do you believe that you have authorization and that these bylaws were approved by the National Board of Trustees? Mr. Holt's response was, they were verbally. Do you have proof that they reviewed them? You have no such endorsement, no copy of minutes, no anything that says that these went to national, were approved, and now are being presented for ratification to the body? Well, Mr. Miller signed it. Well, the question begs, gentlemen and ladies, the job of the NJA at the national level is to approve your bylaws. He approves the bylaws that have been presented to the body of a department that have voted on those bylaws, made their changes, and they send them into the National JA to review to make sure what? They're not in conflict with the national bylaws and that they're good to go, much as Warren Griffin did on the 2019 bylaws for the department. However, Mr. Holt and crew circumvented that, wants us to believe that a verbal consent was given and Mr. Miller authorized and approved them, which is not in accordance with anything, and especially is not in accordance with the national bylaws and administrative procedures on how these kind of things are supposed to proceed. So, again, another point of order came. Because since fall of 2022, Mr. Holt has been telling the body at all meetings and people who are present that the National Board of Trustees approved a deviation in the quorum so that they could include it in the bylaws and make it happen so that they could hold these kind of meetings. Mr. Holt was asked by a member of the department, do you have proof of said authorization from the National Board of Trustees to lower the quorum? Much as the approval they gave for the deviation proposal on April 15th of 2022. A letter came from Johnny Baker indicating such a deviation one-time authorization supported by the National Board of Trustees, and the minutes at the national level supported it. Yet there are no supporting documentations to support, again, Mr. Holt's finding that the national board, approved him to lower the quorum down to a number of delegates present at said meeting. He acknowledged that he had it. He acknowledged that he would provide it at the next conference, which was the winter conference in January of 2023. He failed to bring it or produce it again. They did not have a quorum again. And again, indicated that he'll make sure that everybody gets a copy by the spring meeting. Well, needless to say, folks, we've yet to see that copy. And needless to say, they've yet to have a damn quorum to do anything. So if you believe that the Department of Ohio, with its newly installed Tom Seymour as its commandant, Amy Imperatou as its paymaster, Roger Smith as its JA, John Harkis, and the rest of these knuckleheads was legit, God bless you, please enjoy. And when the department folds up and goes in the shitter, don't look at me, because I tried to tell you, and so did others, that they were not operating in accordance. So, the June convention ended this past Sunday with a whole new slate of officers and everything being copacetic as if they did everything by the book. Everything, again, was done illegally. And Mr. Holt knows this. And Mr. Holt and his crew, the Oversight Committee, know this, and they perpetuated that falsehood, and they allowed it to continue on. It is sad, ladies and gentlemen, it is sad that even the boys cannot follow the idiot in charge directions. They cannot follow the very letter that was submitted to everyone directions. As someone said, they're going to do whatever the hell they want to do. Anyway, and that was evident at this convention, once again. Honestly, I wish them luck. I swear to God I do. I wish them luck, because repeating the same whole shit over and over and expecting a different outcome is the true definition of insanity. And in the end, it hurts the department and brings great discredit upon the league itself by allowing this kind of stuff to continue to be part of the operations of a detachment or a department or even the national organization of the Marine Corps League. As the committee chairman, Mr. Holt should have had a copy of said findings from the investigative committee July 13th through the 31st, I believe it was, yes, 2022. Should have had a copy of those findings. He should have also had a copy of the August 5th letter, which was the result of those findings, an approval from the National Board of Trustees and the National Commandant as to the suspension of the Ohio Charter until June of 2023. Now, this charter is in suspension. The letters give Mr. Holt operational control of the department using the very same officers that caused the issue to begin with. Now, when we say that, Mr. Baker left the very same officers in charge of handling the day-to-day operations and said in his letter that the major reason why the charter was suspended was because of the bylaws being too restrictive and not in compliance as mandated with the national bylaws. And we covered all that, so I'm not going to go into that anymore. That's why we're on suspension. In reality, contained within that same letter, it was discovered and stated by Mr. Baker that the problem stems from, and I get up close to tell you, the persistent failure to meet the quorum requirements due to a lack of participation by many detachments. Go figure. Nobody coming. There has to be a reason they're not coming. It's not because they couldn't get a quorum. It's because they couldn't get people willing to come to a department function. I wonder what that is and why that is. And I think we touched base on it a little bit earlier, but I'm not going to go into that. I think you can figure that out for yourself. So, to find the legitimacy in this August 5th letter, I must note that both the National Parliamentarian and the National's Legal Counsel have reviewed what occurred and concur with the analysis provided in the August 5th letter. So, Mr. Holt, as the chairman, newly assigned chairman, decided to reach out for input to help him in resolving these issues in Ohio so that he could probably or most likely get these things under control and have a good working set of bylaws by June of 2023. He reached out to me and various other individuals, and we provided him with examples, reports, and documentation as to why there was such a low turnout for these functions and what could be done to rectify that and to get that turned around so that we could actually start having a quorum again at our department functions. Mr. Holt's response was golden. He decided, and true to his nature now, we didn't know this at that time, but true to his nature now, he decided not to integrate any of the feedback provided to him and his committee members on how to best serve the department membership. He elected instead to only look at the bylaws, change them up a bit, reword the quorum so that whoever's present is the quorum at these functions, i.e. 10 people show up for a convention, you can have the convention because 10 people are the quorum. And those 10 people will decide what happens in Ohio for all its 33 detachments. 10 people or 15, it just matters who shows up. And the bad thing about this is, folks, a lot of times those 10 people are from the same detachment. So now you have a detachment running the affairs of the department. And that's what they want. That's exactly what they want. So, instead of fixing it, he decides to make it easier on them by making these kind of quorum statements and changes. So that these folks that have violated our trust can continue to stay the course that they have begun down with the Department of Ohio, and they can continue to violate state and federal regulations with no consequences or accountability. And that's just wrong. So, the fall conference of 2022 had no quorum, as expected. Mr. Holt presents the group a set of proposed bylaw changes. Individuals who could download it from the webpage, read through them, submitted arguments and or statements and or facts that would contradict what he's trying to do, and that they actually do contradict the national bylaws, and that we can't ratify these kind of changes. And again, no quorum, no review, no interest. At that time, someone that was present at the fall conference stood up, and I'll leave the name out, but stood up and asked a question. Mr. Holt, who gave you authorization, or who allows you to drop the quorum to those who are present only? His response to that member was, the National Board of Trustees gave me approval to lower the quorum. And when he was asked for documentation as such, i.e. similar to what was given on April 15th from the National Board of Trustees and Johnny Baker to deviate a one-time deviation for the quorum, Mr. Holt could not produce either. Mr. Holt could not produce the minutes that showed that they discussed this and did in fact lower the quorum to delegates present. Mr. Holt's only response was, I must have left it. I will make sure I have it and bring it with me to the winter conference. Everybody was happy, big smiles, and everybody went home. Nothing was said, nothing was done, nothing could get accomplished. No quorum, no business. January 2023 winter conference. Once again, no quorum. Once again, they propose changes to the current bylaws to be ratified. And once again, they post them on the website. Again, the same procedure happened as it did in the fall. The difference here this time, Mr. Holt still did not produce any evidence to support the quorum change down to the delegates. Now, this is a direct and serious conflict of interest and or violation of the national bylaws. One cannot put their name to this where the mob rules. Whoever's present is the quorum. That would not work at the national level. That does not even work at the detachment level. How is that going to work at the department? So again, in true form, Mr. Holt failed to deliver and once again said, for God golly, I will have it at the spring conference. I don't believe he could get it. I don't believe anybody was going to put their name to it. And he was hoping that somebody would forget to ask that question. So he must believe that no one knows that in order for anything to happen from the national and to be mandated as an operational directive, that they have to have a board of trustee meeting, they have to have a quorum at that meeting, they have to discuss those issues. Now, they can go in an executive session and not let you know what they discussed, but if they determine and decide to execute an action plan, that action, once approved within executive session, has to be published in the minutes. It doesn't have to publish what was discussed, how it was discussed. It has to be published in the minutes, just like it was published in the April 15th minutes, indicating that a one-time deviation was authorized. Any appointments of officers in the national organization has to be approved, again, by the Board of Trustees. They have to have a meeting. They have to have minutes of this meeting, and it has to be noted in those minutes. None of this has ever been noted in, nor have they ever had a meeting at the national level governing this reduction of the quorum to delegates present. Mr. Holt has outright lied and failed to produce any supporting evidence, thereby supporting our finding of that he is lying and misrepresented himself and the national to the membership of Ohio. A very serious character flaw on his part. So, it came and went. Mr. Holt, however, was getting annoyed. He's getting annoyed at such a level that he decided to put together a little hit squad. I call it hit squad, goon squad, whatever you want to call it. But he put together a group of individuals to spy and to gather data to possibly shutter one of Ohio's detachments because its membership and certain individuals within that detachment were standing up and asking the questions, what the hell are you doing? So in order to shut that down and to eliminate it, as they did with me, they needed evidence. So this is the time frame where certain things were done that was mentioned in previous slides or presentations. Members of the group were Tom Seymour, Roger Smith, Amy Imperatou, and Tim Sherman. All four of these individuals were and have been pending charges against them for violations of conduct and violations of ORCs and federal rules and regulations with the national office, and the national office has found no merit in any of it, especially the quorum violations, right? No merit. Yet they give it merit in the August 5th letter. And these charges were brought after that determination that no quorum had merit. So, with that said, Tom Seymour, no one knows who instructed him at this point, he purchased cameras using the detachment funds, a credit card. And we talked about this before. These cameras were used to spy on the detachment, its meetings, and membership. When questioned in one detachment meeting, Ms. Imperatou was taking pictures of staff members conducting business. When questioned about that and asked to stop, Mr. Seymour spoke up and said that they were told to do that by, you guessed it, Mr. Holt. They were gathering evidence and building a case so that Miss Imperator could turn around, submit her grievance, which contained 18 violations that later were found by Mr. Holt to be either resolved or in transition to being resolved, or at the fault of the paymaster, who was, at the time of these infractions, Tom Seymour. Yet he'd already resigned and stepped back and had charges dropped for no merit, so now they blame the detachment. In April of 2023, Mr. Holt and his little knucklehead group got together and came to the detachment to shut it down. They believed they had enough evidence to shut that detachment down. Money laundering, misappropriation of funds, misappropriation of donations, falsifying documents, and the list goes on. This is the findings that Mr. Holt put together for Mr. Miller on March 13th. That's why they were there in April, to shut them down. However, as fate would have it, Marines taking care of Marines, not leaguers, but Marines taking care of Marines, had already began rectifying all the issues that Mr. Seymour created in 2022 for the detachment by cleaning up the finances, by gathering the data and trying to rectify and audits and all that good stuff. And lastly, by resolving the money laundering accusation, because Mr. Holt and crew thought that in April they could walk in, suspend the charter, and take or receive the holdings of the detachments, which included a $200,000 building with a bar and all its operational assets. He believed that belonged to the Marine Corps League and that they're going to take it and shut it down. Yet even in his statement, it was a defunct organization, it was a defunct charity, and it no longer fell into the realm or control of the Marine Corps League. So what Marines did, and they did it within the law, they did it step by step, they redeveloped that foundation, they made it legal, they put it in the proper format, they got all the right documents, they did everything in accordance with the law, and all Mr. Holt could say when he showed up in April after telling the detachment, JA, we're going to close you down, is that Mr. Smith stole your building for a price of a burger and a beer. You guys got bamboozled. I can't believe this. He was upset. They walked out of that detachment meeting without doing a damn thing to that detachment because they thought that nobody cared enough to help them through it. And that's what Mr. Holt's all about. He's not about helping Ohio. He never was about helping Ohio. He's about helping himself and those members who are disloyal to Ohio. So, in a nutshell, Mr. Holt's investigative report that he submitted back in March of 2023 validates all the statements that have been made here today. However, the one thing they want most didn't materialize. They couldn't get that foundation. They couldn't get that building. And I praise God for that. I really do. So, all of that has prompted a new saying down there at that detachment. This, of course, an individual got for the cost of a burger and a beer. In the end, the detachment remains open and operational for its membership, and that is why we do what we do. That's the end result of that. So, all of this since August of 2022 culminates in the June convention of the Department of Ohio that just took place this past weekend. You do remember a few slides back when I discussed the quorum issues. We also discussed the August 5th letter of 2022 that started this process for the Oversight Committee and Mr. Holt. Now, this letter was from Mr. Baker and approved by the National Board of Trustees. It also, we also talked about the draft proposed bylaws that they wanted to put into place at this convention. And as of today, we all know that they truly were not reviewed and or approved by the National Board of Trustees prior to the body here at the Ohio Department Convention could review them and approve them and send back to Mr. Miller. They circumvented the department by just giving them to Mr. Miller. He threw a signature sheet on them and basically he's telling everybody this is what you're going to be doing. Not happening. That's not the way it works. And there are checks in place for that to not allow the rule of mob order within the department. So, the quick issues, the down and dirty of it all of this past convention are Mr. Holt is fully aware of the contents of the August 5th letter and the operational requirements that were placed upon him as the chairman of the Oversight Committee. Once the June summer convention was beginning to open, there was no official set of bylaws, except for those from national. You see, if the department's bylaws are suspended, as noted, then the national bylaws take precedence as a ruling document. The national bylaws mandate such an action, just as it mandates you have a quorum. At the opening ceremony, again, the department did not have a quorum to open as per the national bylaws, section 410, article 4, section 410. From the detachment level to the national level, the bylaws must be in accordance with the national documents approved August 2022 and not in conflict. And if not, the items not contained in those bylaws, then you to revert to the Roberts Rules of Order, newly revised edition. So in Article 8, Section 835 of the national bylaws, it states that the department cannot have a convention without a quorum of the majority of the chartered detachments in attendance. They only had 11. You now know that the proposed draft of the bylaws never were approved. And there was never any kind of supporting documentation to say otherwise. You also know in order to present this draft to the body for approval, you got to have a quorum to open the convention. You didn't have that, so the convention never opened. Roll call of detachments was brought up as a point of order, and it was determined there was only 11 detachments present out of 33. I'm sure you can come up with what the majority is supposed to be. A second point of order came up regarding the lack of said quorum, and Mr. Holt informed the body he had verbal permission again to reduce the quorum to those present. Again, without any substantiating documentation. We're supposed to just take his word for it. So, without a quorum, we already found out the body is unable to do what is necessary to be accomplished at convention. They cannot elect or appoint any officers. They cannot install said officers. They cannot conduct any financial transactions on behalf of the department. And not least, they cannot approve the proposed bylaws and administrative procedures for the Department of Ohio. So in essence, in essence, overall, since August 5th, 2022, the department has not been able, or the Oversight Committee has not been able to solve a single issue that was addressed in the August 5th letter. Not one. A great waste of manpower, energy, and monies went into this with no viable results provided. Absolutely zero. And this is attributed to the Oversight Committee, who actually has some of the National Central Division Vice Commandants on it, along with other past National Vice Commandants on it. And they could not resolve the single most important issue that was discovered to put the charter on suspension to begin with. This also applies to the Veteran Service Program. They still have no elected directors or appointed directors since June of 2019. They have yet to approve or have an appropriate audit that's approved by these installed individuals. And they continue to receive state funding and doing whatever the hell they want to do because they have no accountability. It all sounds great. So, with the Oversight Committee's inabilities, the National's leadership capabilities not validated, unaffected in the state of Ohio, only perpetuated further, and will only perpetuate further filings against all three of these organizations. They can't be allowed to continue to operate in such a haphazard manner with no regard to the policies and procedures and the ethical standards of its membership or the organization. Perhaps, just perhaps, they could use the suggestions for resolution that were provided many times by the guy they threw out because he knew too much. In summary, ladies and gentlemen, the Department of Ohio is still in violation of both state and federal laws. The National's intervention has not changed it and has only made it worse by alienating more detachments. They continue to see the inadequacies of its leadership. They, as many do nationwide, are now content just to operate in their respective communities, vice the department or national arenas. It is the detachments that are the backbone of the organization, and it's the detachments that perpetuate what it means to be a Marine Corps leader. It's not the national staff nor the department staff. As we have seen throughout these presentations, neither can be trusted with what it means to be a Marine, first of all, and secondly, what it means to you to be a leader and to help continue to serve your community. Mr. Holt has perpetuated the ideology that the national and department officers are liars and that they could give a shit about them or their detachment. That they are in it for a cover or a title that may have eluded them while serving on active duty. But Mr. Holt and the committee members have lied to the membership of Ohio on multiple occasions. We will be moving into the NJAs on our next presentation. Have yet to decide personally whether to combine Phil Samora and Russ Miller into one presentation or two. No matter, you will, if you so choose, hear from me again. Until next time, Marines, Semper Fi, and God bless.